I bring my perspectives, which are, creating things that are very out of the box and kind of pushing against social norms and really like kind of asking big questions. And also, importantly, using humor. I mean, I think a lot of my trans communities are so incredible at using humor to go, you know what? Stuff is really rough. I mean, in the world at the moment, stuff is really rough. And so, and that's something I particularly feel strongly about this work, climate change and other small talk, is to use humor and satire and absurdity to get in sideways.
What if the truth came in a gel cap and we could just pop it in our mouths and forget about it? Well, it doesn't, and we can't. But we can laugh in the face of reality while plotting our survival. Welcome to the Truth Tastes Funny podcast. I am your host, Hirsch Redpun. And if my guests can handle the truth, so can you. Open wide, folks. Here it comes. My guest today is Sonny Drake. Sonny is an award-winning playwright whose innovative and diverse works have been showcased in over 60 cities worldwide. He's also the leader of Climate Change and Other Small Talk, the podcast, and his journey was kind of unconventional because he taught himself the craft of theater making due to a lack of inclusion for trans individuals in a traditional theater setting. Sonny, welcome to Truth Tastes Funny.
Hi, Hirsch. It's great to be on the show.
It's great to have you here. Let's start with the self-taught theater making and what you confronted in that situation. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up and how that theater experience started.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I grew up in Australia, and despite growing up in the third largest city, I literally did not meet another person who I knew was out as trans until my 20s. And I grew up in an entire void of transcultural content in any medium. I had no access to books. There were no trans characters on TV except for that kind of, the token unnamed trans woman character. It wasn't even really a token character. It was just a trope who would often exist in a kind of, 90s or early noughts comedy, basically to sort of, there would be a cis guy goes into a bar and meets a woman who then it turns out is a trans woman. And it's the kind of the butt of the joke. So it's never sort of any kind of depth of character or anything other than that story or trope. So in books, in movies, in theater, an entire void of transcultural content. And in fact, then when I became really interested in theater and considered going to theater school, at the time I would have been cast in women's roles, which now that I'm so much further into my journey I think would be really fun to be cast in women's roles. Women's are super cool and awesome. At the time for me, that wouldn't have felt, validating or okay for me. So yeah, I didn't feel like theater school was a place for me. Theater schools are certainly changing a lot now, but back in that time, it wouldn't have been a place that would have felt like a good learning environment for me. So I just really, every time I was either interested in something, intrigued by something, confused about something, working through something in my life, it would bust out into a performance piece. And slowly, I built enough of a body of work over the years that then I went from performing in backyards and basements and living rooms and bathtubs and all the rest to then being able to access institutions, and now sort of, worked my way through to then having one of my works premiere last year at Canada's largest theatre company and one of the world's largest English theatre festival. So really kind of just worked my way, through making work and falling flat on my face and picking myself up and making more work. And yeah, that's how I've gotten to this point today.
So with the theater community, we always think of the theater community as being very accepting and very experimental, open, whether it's artistic expression or lifestyle or identification. We have come over the years to think of the theater community as, a safe haven, as a welcoming place. Was it because of your geographical location, or where was it that you were trying to kind of break into theater or find training in theater?
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't just my geographical location. And it's not that, I mean, theater people, you're right, are often, certainly on the kind of edge of like pushing, for social change and social justice, etc. But still, theater folks are not, still part of their context. And so, some of the changes we're seeing now are because we've had, a lot of traction in the mainstream around trans movements. I mean, we're seeing now a huge backlash with, we kind of took a lot of steps forward in terms of trans visibility, trans rights, etc. Now we're taking a lot of steps back with literally hundreds of anti-trans bills, around North America and beyond. So just to say, yes, I mean, I love people in my theatre community. My theatre community is amazing, and they're not immune to the context that all of us operate in. And so, this many of the similar sort of shifts have needed to happen in the theatre community as outside of it.
What was your childhood experience like in such a small community?
I mean, for me, I think I had a very sort of trans and non-binary childhood in the way that even though I didn't have the language for that, but I had parents who really just kind of let me sort of do pretty much whatever, certainly as a very young child. And then, when I got to school, I really buried a lot of kind of trans impulses because, like I said, I had no language, I had no people around me, I had no frameworks to understand, which is certainly, I mean, now I make work that is a lot broader about many different things. My earlier career was certainly about kind of really exploring and expanding the canon of work, by trans folks and about trans folks. And now also, I mean, what I feel really strongly about now is, I think that the coming out stories are certainly still important. I think also, though, what I feel strongly in my work is I want to see trans characters tackling climate change or dealing with housing stuff or, looking at alternative economies. And I want to see a wide range of characters, both trans and non-trans, getting to do the rest of our lives rather than sort of having our work always reduced to a very narrow slice of our lives about physical transition, for example, or about our childhoods, etc. So yeah, I think I'm excited to be able to bring my perspectives, even when I make work that is not necessarily about quote unquote trans themes. I do feel like I bring my perspectives, which are creating things that are very out of the box and kind of pushing against social norms and really like kind of asking big questions. And also, importantly, using humor. I mean, I think a lot of my trans communities are so incredible at using humor to go, you know what, stuff is really rough. I mean, in the world at the moment, stuff is really rough. And so, and that's something I particularly feel strongly about this work, climate change and other small talk, is to use humor and satire and absurdity to get in sideways. So many people are flicking through the news, and we all care about climate change. Most people know what's happening and we want to see things change, but we turn on the news and it's depressing. It's like, we're looking at a really dire state, and we have to talk about that and we have to be real about that. But this project and a lot of my work really aims to get in sideways by kind of going, let's have a laugh about it. And then we can talk about the really serious thing because we're sort of relaxed and laughing and we have some kind of coping tools through humor to get in sideways.
Yeah, and I think that sideways entrance to difficult topics is, what this podcast is about in many ways. Truth Tastes Funny is born of that notion that stuff that's uncomfortable is the stuff that we need to talk about, but we have to diffuse it somehow. I wanted to write a feature comedy about nuclear proliferation, but do it in such a way where, it's about, I never wrote it, but it was a few years ago. My wife works in that area, and it's so heavy and it's so, difficult, both climate and nuclear. And, these are things that people don't want to talk about. I envisioned a guy who was retired, who had kind of given up his family for his career, and now he's an alcoholic, and it's his birthday, and the only person who seems to remember is someone he used to work with at one of the nuclear silos. And it turns into this kind of action adventure of trying to save the world and shut down the nuclear and all that stuff, but couched in comedy, because what else
Absolutely.
do you do? So tell me more about the podcast and
Uh,
you've been trying to do with it.
Yeah. Also, it's a theatrical podcast, so it's short audio dramas. So where rather than sort of like an audio book where a narrator is reading out something that was clearly meant to be for the page,
Right.
this is actors, incredible dynamic professional actors performing these audio dramas. And it's 9 short episodes from created by 9 different teams around the world. And I'll tell you a little bit about how the idea came about because it's
Yeah.
sort of important in the ethos of the project. So I was, feeling super concerned, as most of us are, about climate change and decided, right, I'm going to write a full length play. I got accepted into this residency on a tall ship in the high Arctic, so way north of Scandinavia, just 10 degrees south of the North Pole. Went on this tall ship with 30 artists and scientists. And we went and visited the world's northernmost climate research station in New Allison. And so up there, scientists are doing their work collecting local weather data and looking very cool in their lab coats and science get-ups. And that local information is really important in understanding the local conditions of climate change. But it's also equally important they combine their data together with hundreds of other weather stations around the world. And it's that really local with that really global that makes, that gives us that important information about, what's going on and what needs to happen. And so I thought, why not do the same thing with artists? So rather than me writing this full length play or even me writing, a series of short plays, I invited instead 9 teams of artists from around the world to create their own local audio drama, which really digs into sort of, local perspectives and themes and then present them together in this podcast to kind of see what's the interaction between these stories and what's the relationship between them, what's the differences. And also then have this kind of podcast that it's like a worldwide tour for your ears, minus the carbon footprint and the screaming kids. And,
Yeah.
it's a way for us to kind of dip into these climate stories around the world to then also utilize in our local communities to try to really kind of bring people into climate movements and to taking action.
I love that. And also, it's funny. Now there's a move on the part of YouTube to get more engaged with podcasts, and the video component of podcasts is becoming more prominent. And that's great in terms of getting the shows out in front of people, because some people just love video. But I also love the resurgence of radio, so to speak, the treat for your ears. I've listened to a lot of the true life, let's just call them, because they're not all true crime. There's plenty that are true crime, but the true life narratives that play so well on podcast series. And I love that there's no video component. I love that it's
Yeah.
theatrical and you can imagine it. I was just telling my daughter about artists and how that works and how you
Yeah.
create sound
Yeah.
effects for movies, and I love the audio aspect of it.
Well, what's so wild, Hirsch, is that it's almost more vivid what we can do. And this is where sort of I love the relationship between theater and audiences,
Mhm.
where you are in a contract with an audience that says, we know this is not real. You are going to help us with your imagination. But unlike live theater, where you have a kind of visual component, or unlike film or TV with that visual component that is, that already engages that sense. When you have only audio, the audience actually has a much more active imagination and can really fill out those worlds in such a powerful way. And sound is so evocative. You can bring someone into, radio plays are often described as movies for your ears. You can bring someone into a very vivid array of senses just using audio. And, and particularly also with climate change and other small talk, what I'm excited about is also the interaction between audio, so this podcast series, and live events, so in-person events. So each of these 9 companies around the world, and then also it will be an offering to other groups, theaters, climate groups, schools, etc., to utilize this audio-only thing to bring people together in real time in person spaces. And it's think of it as sort of almost akin to, back pre TV, families used to sit around a radio and they would listen to radio stories, and or people sitting around a campfire and telling story. So there's this really interesting interaction, and I've done it before with a previous work of mine during the pandemic, where a company hosted a live listening party of one of these radio dramas. And it was actually really fascinating what happened, because people at first didn't have anywhere to look, like
Right.
no stage to look at. They actually had to be together with each other, listening to these audio dramas in a really different way. And so it became a much more kind of social experience. And that's what we're really going for as well with this podcast is, yes, there's this whole way you can interact on your own and listen to it, while you're walking the dog or doing the cleaning. But you can also, having these kind of live events that bring the podcast sort of out of the audio only realm and experience it together in these in-person events too.
I love that. It would be great if we could revive that aspect of listening, listening together, listening
Yeah.
parties, families. You get that image of a family, a group of people in front of a radio, looking at the radio as though it were the TV, right? Looking at each other. And
Yep.
everybody's actually got a different vision in their head of
Yep.
what is really happening there. But we're
Yep.
sharing this, as you alluded to, the suspense of disbelief, the contract with the audience. What are the plays you mentioned that initially in your playwriting, you were obviously expressing a lot of what you'd personally gone through. Then you're expanding it into issues and subjects. But what works inspired your sense of humor when you're writing? Are there influences and things that you finally got to be exposed to that you were impressed upon?
I'm actually my creative work is quite influenced by 90s Australian cinema. So I don't know if you know Muriel's Wedding,
Yes,
Strictly
sure.
Ballroom,
Yeah,
The
yeah.
Castle, a lot of those shows that use very sharp satire. So basically use this sort of dialed up version of reality that can sort of seem absurd or slightly ridiculous at first, until you're laughing along because it feels absurd, and then suddenly, boom, like, we've gone to somewhere very deep that you actually have gone from laughing quite hysterically to, a really devastating moment. And then we get eased back out on the other side with, comedy and humor again. But the parameters I gave for climate change and other small talk are, either any form of humor, satire, or absurdity. So we've got quite a wide range of works in this series, from political satires like, okay, what happens when the US military tries to go green? And, you might know that the US military are a huge, a very significant polluter and emitter on the world scale. And so, could things get much worse? Well, spoiler alert, yes, they do get a lot worse in this satire when trying to go green. Or we have, off the coast of India, down in a submarine, two officers receiving kind of quite absurd orders to seek and destroy climate change, and really as sort of this satirical way to explore kind of inaction on the part of world leaders and differing responsibilities of different nations. And so that's sort of on the satirical end. And then we have the kind of witty banter end, which is, for example, an Indigenous playwright in Australia wrote this very endearing and fun piece about Nana and Pop, who are learning about climate change from their granddaughter and are absolutely horrified to learn about cows farting and other things like that. So we've kind of got the other end of the spectrum there as well.
Right. Are you familiar with Tim Minchin? Tim Minchin
No.
is the Australian. He's a composer and a comedian, and he wrote the music and lyrics for Matilda for the stage.
Okay, right.
Matilda,
Yes, of course.
And has a very kind of anti-establishment sense of humor. It's sometimes dark, but it's always biting. And that's been his way of, comedians, it's one thing for them to kind of speak up and but there's something about music and something about lyrics that, again, lets us get in. I love that expression, sideways. It allows us to get in sideways to a topic that we may not want to talk about, something that may be too challenging. What do you think? What do you see ahead of us with our kind of still these heads in the sand? Like, you would, on the one hand, you would think people would be running around literally screaming that the sky is falling, but because we don't see the sky falling climate-wise, we do actually. I mean, we've got snow in California. We've got crazy weather everywhere. We've got intensified and increased frequency of natural disasters. I don't know what more we really, need, but we're still not running around with our voices raised in a Armageddon type panic. What do you know about that's happening in let's say the next few years?
Yeah. And it's a really interesting point you're making too. I've been really fascinated by research that suggests, okay, well, on the one hand, we have the media that says, okay, in times of disaster, we turn Lord of the Flies, which is actually, there's a bunch of research which suggests literally completely the opposite, that in times of emergency, human beings actually become more collective, more cooperative,
Right.
etc. So there's clearly then something getting in the way of that. Many things getting in the way of that impulse. And, because really what we need and what this podcast is a firm believer in is that we need to get together to act collectively. It's not enough to kind of, and we have a whole impact campaign going on with our podcast as well, so that the idea is really to kind of have people have a really fun time with listening to the episodes and then provide very concrete kind of ways that people can become involved in climate movements, because and shifting away from the suggestions are not recycle more or do
Right.
something on your individual level, even though individual actions are of course important as well. The suggestions are really about looking at how can we come together, because people en masse are going to, increasingly need to organize around, policy solutions and around these larger things, because the problems are happening on a larger systemic level. It's not one individual that is causing the problem. It's how we've sort of organized so many of our churches and institutions, and really, fundamentally coming down to, our relationship with the earth is really out of whack.
Yeah.
So really needing to actually shift on quite a foundational and an enormous level, recalibrate our relationship away from seeing the planet as our ATM that we can just withdraw from indefinitely, and
Yeah.
instead kind of really re-looking at how do we actually be part of this ecosystem in a way that looks after ourselves and the ecosystem. And so, like organizations like one of our campaign folks who we are lifting up through the project, for example, 350.org or Dogwood BC or the Wilderness Committee. And folks can look on our website, which is climatechangeandothersmalltalk.com. And we've got a very concrete take action section that points people towards these campaigns and projects and that they can get involved with. But I think also to say, there's the good news and the bad news. The bad news is the kind of change we're talking about, it has to happen on a massive scale and quite quickly.
Hmm.
The good news is because there is so much change that needs to happen, literally pick something that you're passionate about. It could be anything, any area of life that you're passionate about. There is some way to get together with groups of people to organize around that very particular thing in terms of climate, because the climate impacts every area of our life.
Yeah.
Our beloved household pets, ticks and other kind of parasites and bacteria are migrating to areas they've never been seen before. Football games are being delayed by extreme weather events. Growing cycles are being impacted. Like literally, if you're a gardener, if you're an anything that you're passionate and interested about, there
Yeah.
is a way that climate change is impacting that thing. And therefore, there is also a way that you can get together with people who you want to hang out with and be around and organize around that particular thing.
But the overarching theme here seems to be, let's do this together. This isn't about everybody do
Exactly.
their part. We're beyond the everybody do their part. Yeah, that's great. Don't stop composting, but let's get together and organize, and let's figure these things out together. And also, I think, Sonny, that when people start to work together, they accept reality a little more, because
Yep.
I could do my composting without anybody knowing about it, which reduces the amount of awareness and investment that we all have in solutions. Everybody
Yep.
quietly doing their own thing or not. You
Yep.
know,
Yep.
um,
Absolutely.
so
Yeah, and that everyone do their part still applies in the collective area. Like, it's not that everyone needs to kind of try to save the planet single-handedly. There's almost a relief in working collectively with people
right,
because it means it's not all up to you. It means you get the nourishment, you get the ideas, you get the community. And I mean, you know, we are in an epidemic of loneliness, a lot of people feeling very isolated and lonely,
right,
and also a lot of people, struggling with a lack of kind of, describing that they don't feel satisfied or happy. And so looking at kind of like what can give us meaning rather than necessarily even happiness, what can give us meaning and purpose. And we have this kind of thing going on a massive scale that is actually an opportunity to bring people together, to do that thing I was saying about in times of emergency, where actually a natural human impulse is to work together collectively. To so really sort of removing some of the things that get in the way of us coming together and working collectively. And to do that, we're going to need to start to organize, and we're going to need to make mistakes and
yeah,
mess up and do things really badly, because that's part of the point, is we need to learn how to do this because we've forgotten, or when I say we, many of us, have
right.
forgotten how to, and I put myself in that category too. I need to be relearning how to kind of engage with, collective groups of people and how to rewrite my relationship with the planet.
Now, what about the thing that I always come back to when we talk about climate? And I do think I don't want us to be paralyzed by the enormity of the situation or the crisis. And I think, again, working together helps get us out of that. Okay, I'm not alone. We're not alone. We have each other. We can do something. We can collectively do something. What about the powers that are dead set, it seems, on thwarting progress in this area, that are so committed to denial and thwarting the effort? What are they thinking? What are these people thinking? That they're somehow not going to be affected by it? What's your take on that, Sonny?
Yeah. I mean, I think for starters, to put our finger on and say it's a very, very small minority of people who are the powers to be, who are thwarting efforts. And that small minority of people, I think, I mean, who knows? I think are more invested and interested in their own short term profit and gain, or, and I mean, we see in fact that people who have more resources are more able to weather, climate
Yeah,
impacts. They're not impacted, but in the shorter term and in the longer term, everybody is going to be impacted. It's also, when we talk
right.
about climate justice, some people are differently impacted. So I think a very small minority of people also not present to the fact that there is no getting out, even with a lot of resources, you still might be demolished by a hurricane. That's just a reality of, or
Yeah,
an earthquake sorry, so that's just sort of an incorrect relationship to your own, mortality in any case. But a small minority of people who are then with, using a lot of resources to manipulate masses of people into acting against their own interests. So, we
yeah,
see then, for example, the right really targeting a lot of poor and working class communities into policies which don't in any way benefit poor and working class
Yeah.
communities, but really using and playing on hot button cultural topics, or playing on fears, or attempting to connect into values, like connecting into values, for example, of family, and twisting
Mhm.
that value to, make policies that are against people's own best interests seem enticing. So I think that, like, it's, on the one hand, the good news is it's a very small minority of people who are manipulating a lot more people into, not acting, or into acting in
Against their
ways that are not
interests. Yeah.
helping. Yeah, yeah. But so that's, the good news is that it's a very small minority of people. The bad news, obviously, then is that they have a lot of resources. And so that is having a way outsized impact. But it also means that, there's an opportunity to bring people together to organize in different ways, and to, because I'm very convinced that most people care about the climate, most people care about their families, most people care about their communities, and don't want to see us destroying our habitats, our environments, our pets, our animal friends, our communities. And I think that is the wake up of, that is happening at the moment. And there's a real opportunity to channel that awareness and that waking up into action, and organize us all together to really figure out, um, how are we going to tackle this? And when I say figure out, I mean, we actually have a lot of the solutions already.
Right.
It's a matter of kind of figuring out, how are we going to put these into policy? How are we going to get the buy-in for, on a policy level and on a larger systemic level? How are we going to get that buy-in to, turn the ship around?
Yeah. Yeah. And the other good news is that people are still interested in entertainment. And so whether it's with
Yep,
humor or the arts, just the arts in general, we have the ability to grab the attention of a hungry audience. And so,
absolutely.
if we can continue to go in sideways, use humor, use the unexpected. I think that's a part of humor that really works in these situations. The film Don't Look Up was a great example. It was, by no means the perfect movie, but certainly, Adam McKay was able to take something that is people just want to ignore, want to forget about, want to put their head in the sand, and put it out there in such a way. And I love the statement about, what it said about those few people in power who believe that somehow it won't affect them. And of course, saying,
Hmm.
yeah, it kind of will. You may not even
Hmm.
get it, even at the end. You being the person that thinks that in the short term they're winning, and then there isn't
Yep.
any long term. But there's so much that we can do. So how, we'll have all this stuff in the show notes, but tell the audience where they should go first, how they can get involved and take advantage of the content you're putting out and so forth.
Yeah. Well, the podcast itself will be available anywhere you listen to podcasts. It's called Climate Change and Other Small Talk. And we have a whole sort of website interface as well, climatechangeandothersmalltalk.com, where folks can, dive deeper into the themes and look at the episodes, and, learn more about the writers and the creative teams from around the world. There's the take action pages I mentioned. And there's also, we're really encouraging folks to sign up to the newsletter, because the newsletter is a little more akin to kind of a zine that will arrive in your inbox once a week for, for the duration of the project, for 9 weeks. And it's kind of the bonus content and the sort of diving deeper into lots of things. There's also going to be a listening party guide and a discussion guide. So we're encouraging folks to go, okay, how fun and unique and different would your next dinner party be if you hosted a listening party? Pick one of the episodes. You could even do it times, or pick a couple of the episodes. They're short, and sit around in the living room and listen to the episodes together, and then have a conversation and discussion. And both, sort of get to enjoy the fun of the series, and then engage each other in conversation as well. And we've got a bunch of resources. That's the guide for how to host a listening party, and also a discussion guide towards that as well.
Thanks so much for tuning into Truth Tastes Funny. If you enjoyed the experience, please leave a 5-star review and share this podcast with your friends.